Democracy in 1960. Apartheid's planners created the Indian township of Chatsworth, evicting people from established neighbourhoods around Durban and forcibly settling them into a grid of modern racial ghetto. The book Chatsworth, The Making of a South African Township, brings together an exhilarating mix of voices that collectively tell the story of Chatsworth's origins and transformations. Well, to tell us now more, we're joined in the studio by Ashwin Desai, who is the co-editor of this particular book. It's good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live, Ashwin.
Thank you so much.
How well do South Africans know about the history of Chatsworth?
Not in any deep fashion. You know, it's probably anecdotal. You know, the Hare Krishna temple. Have an idea that it's probably one of the largest Indian townships outside India anywhere in the world, but have no deep sense of how it's been changed and how there's continuity in Chatsworth.
Yeah. Would you say that the apartheid government's group areas legislation that saw people being moved from their homes in Sophia Town and District 6 had the same impact to Chatsworth?
I think it does. But what historians and social scientists are starting to do now is how do we think through this area? And Jacob Schlamini's Native Nostalgia is a lead there in saying, just don't talk about oppression and exploitation. People made a life. They had some fun. They created new soccer teams, new sense of entertainment, and created new lives for themselves. And so also enjoyed places like Chatsworth, rather than just seeing it as a ghetto where people were huddled together in misery.
Yeah, it's amazing that this actually started out as a research program. I believe it was called A Case Study of Chatsworth. Why publish a book? What made you and Ghulam Vahed decide that this is actually worthy of making a book out of?
Well, one of the things is often when we research things, we sort of know what we're going to come out with. But I think Chatsworth shocked us, that we had a sense of continuity, but we had no sense of the change. And when we started to think about, for example, the younger generation coming through the 1990s, and just how they fundamentally started to change the very place in which they lived in, just by the expression of their sexuality, for example.
Yeah.
More women on the streets, young men, if they were gay, expressing themselves in a very open way. The changing nature of religion, that the fastest growing religion, for example, in Chatsworth, is Pentecostal Christianity.
Wow.
We thought we needed to tell South Africans and the world that don't think you can just have an homogenous population that you can put a label on. That there are fundamental changes here. And sometimes politicians and academics, we talk about race and class and gender in very abstract terms. But here, for example, people are starting to build a new South Africa. It's deracializing, and people are starting to reach out to each other in very fundamental and everyday ways. And we were trying to understand that.
Let's go back in the history. When did Chatsworth, or should I say, when were the first residents found in Chatsworth? When did it all start out?
Yeah, like everything in Chatsworth, it's argued about when exactly and who was the first person. So 1962, 1963 would be the first people who come there. It's a barren landscape, and they're coming from Clarewood, Riverside, Cato Manor, where they lived for 50 or 60 years. But people didn't move as whole communities. So it was quite a traumatic move, because suddenly you didn't know your neighbor, you didn't have the kind of basic amenities, you were suddenly living sort of 10, 15, 20, 30 kilometers from your place of work. So the first years were incredibly difficult for people. But by the early 70s, they had started to develop a community already. And that's the fascinating thing about Chatsworth. In a way, they rebuilt what they lost, but it was on very new terrain and very new ground.
Yeah. So you obviously interviewed a lot of the residents of Chatsworth, and besides, talking about suddenly you've got to travel all of these distances, what were some of the stories that they came up with the early years of Chatsworth, of living there? Was it tough? Did they enjoy it, or not the life they wanted?
Well, I think it was tough, but for a lot of people it was liberating. For people who make a cliche about the extended family, that you could have bigger houses in Cato Manor, and suddenly in Chatsworth you arrived as a nuclear family, because the flats only allowed 1 room or 2 rooms. So you had the end of the extended family. But people romanticized the extended family. A lot of women, for example, said, for the first time, we could love our husbands on our own without the gaze of the mother-in-law. And we didn't have to cook for 10 or 12 people. Yeah. So sometimes for women, the nuclear family was seen as liberating. And the very first Indian women started to work in the factories of Clarewood as independent people. And that's one of the striking things we came about. How many single women in Chatsworth are bringing up families because they've been separated, divorced, because they had an independence by earning their own money. So, what we try to do in the book is to see both sides. The side of oppression, the side of exploitation, the Group Areas Act, but also see the excitement of building a new township. And for many people by the mid-70s, Chatsworth was the only home they knew.
Yeah. Politics. I know we're wrapping. There's so many more questions I'd love to ask you. I mean, we saw some great politicians coming out of Chatsworth. We're talking about Amichandra Banzi, Fatima Mir. They played a vital role in the transformation of South Africa. Was politics a big issue in Chatsworth?
I think it's a big issue in many ways. And you're right, it produced characters, more than politicians. So, Raj Bansi had all these wonderful sayings. And I think people still remember them. We'll double-cross that bridge when we come to it. A leopard never changes its spots. He had this kind of sense of a grander figure, but yet he was a Chatsworthian. And I think all over the world that you go, people still have a sense. They haven't been to Chatsworth in 20, 30 years, but they have a sense of identity, we Chatsworthians. And that's what we try to bring out in the book.
Amazing. I'm sure a lot of people would love to read this. Is it in bookstores around the country?
It's already in bookstores, and we'll launch at UJ on the 6th of March.
Fantastic. On the 6th of March, it does that. And just remember that every single Wednesday at this time, we're going to reflect on the 20 years of our democracy. And this morning, our focus was on the township of Chatsworth. Very different now, Chatsworth.
Fundamentally different, changing its racial composition all the time.
Yeah.
Many more African people. And in a sense, that's why we call it a South African township. It is here that we're going to make or break our country. Not in the highfalutin conferences of social cohesion, non-racialism, the Rainbow Nation. It's whether in places like Chatsworth, Indian and African, for example, can build a new culture, a new sense of South Africanism that we're going to really build on the 20 years of democracy. And that's what we try to bring to bear in the book, continuity and change.
Well, all the best with the book and all the best with Chatsworth going forward into this 20 years of democracy. Ashwin Desai, co-editor of Chatsworth, The Making of a South African Township.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a break.